So I've done a ton of videos on Nick Fuentes, and generally I do find him funny, but I don't sit down and spend hours watching his content. In this interview, you're going to see why people have problems with Nick Fuentes, and I think there's no way that Piers Morgan can take an L on this interview. This is what Candace Owens tried to do when she sat down with Nick Fuentes. This is what they wanted Tucker Carlson to do when he sat down with Nick Fuentes. However, this time with Piers Morgan, it worked. This is Hey Brittany. Welcome back. Okay, so I feel like this has been a tough week for Nick Fuentes. People are not liking the Steven Crowder interview. We also had Ian Carroll versus Nick Fuentes, and that was just a brutal takedown and a expose of Nick Fuentes not really knowing what is going on, what evidence is out there as it relates to the Charlie Kirk murder investigation. And so I did not even finish watching all of that, but it was just brutal to see him walk through like, hey, this is the evidence that we have. Why are you saying this? And I really think that Nick hurt himself by saying, hey, there's no evidence, because obviously what people are saying is that he just hates Candace Owens so much that he's just going to be on the opposite side of whatever she is promoting, advocating for, that kind of thing, right? And so him saying there's no evidence is where he's going wrong. It would be different if he said, hey, I've seen the evidence, I don't agree with it, it's not compelling, because then it's subjective, then it's your personal opinion based on what you've seen. But if you imply or you directly state there's no evidence and everyone out there can see that there's evidence, that makes you look crazy. And so that is what everyone is reacting to. That is why Ian Carroll called him out and did that brutal takedown, exposing and explaining what evidence people are using to base their theories, their conspiracy theories on what happened with Charlie Kirk. And the most ironic thing is that Nick Fuentes talks about how he was feuding with Charlie Kirk, how they hid each other, how they didn't want to see each other succeed, that sort of thing. And how ironic would it be that now that Charlie Kirk is no longer here, he is still interfering with Nick Fuentes' career. And I say that because how crazy would it be that Nick gets canceled off of a Charlie Kirk conspiracy theory that he doesn't agree with? That is pretty wild. Now, getting back to his interview with Piers Morgan, if Nick Fuentes had sat down with Piers Morgan instead of Candace Owens back in June or July, whenever it was, I don't think that Nick would have gone on a generational run. That interview with Candace was very unique because he didn't punch back, he didn't hit back, he barely defended himself, and so as a result, it made Candace Owens look very bad. In that sense, it was very easy to say, hey, I like Candace, but no, you were rude to Nick and all of that stuff, right? But with Piers Morgan, the energy was very different and it actually backfired and, in my opinion, made Nick Fuentes look really bad. Alrighty, so let's get into the general vibes of the interview. So in my opinion, this was Nick's worst interview of the year. Piers definitely burned him a few times. I laughed a lot during this interview. They both had really good one-liners, but I think that there's no way that Piers really looks bad in this situation. Like, obviously Tucker Carlson got canceled, or they tried to cancel him, but he is still doing pretty well, right? So that is going to happen to Piers Morgan and he's going to be just fine, or he's going to look like a really good guy for really holding Nick Fuentes' feet to the fire, which is what he did. So while I was laughing at some of the things that Nick Fuentes said, you do find him funny in this interview, but you also recognize that you don't quite see him the same way when you see how Piers Morgan catches him in a few traps and how Piers Morgan words certain things. The other thing I want to point out is that in comparison to his other interviews that he did, this was the first interview that I saw where it was remote. So I know that Nick usually joins Alex Jones remotely, and Alex Jones is always interrupting him, and Nick just lets it slide. Here, he got really frustrated, and there's one point in the interview where he's like, hey, what's with all of the interruptions? And he's frustrated, right? And so that is out of the norm for him, in my opinion, and you can really see what other people were talking about, because Dad Saved America did a reaction to the Tucker Carlson Nick Fuentes interview, and he was talking about how Nick is different when he's interviewing with people than he is on his show, and he was basically saying that that's not the real Nick Fuentes, that's like a persona, that's like a facade, that's not who he really is, right? So he didn't understand the switch. And I thought that that was just genuine. I thought that he didn't need to be as showboaty, as over the top as he is on his own show when he goes on other people's platforms. So I did think that he was genuinely being respectful, being well-mannered and all of that stuff, and not resorting to the antics. But the antics definitely came out in this interview. And so what I was saying about this being a remote interview, all of his other ones have been in person, and I think that that contributed to him being more respectful, whereas with this one, it was remote. And so this is getting into what Blake Neff was saying about how in order to be authentic, it needs to be an in-person sit-down interview, and so this was not in person, but it was also kind of the most authentic Nick has been. And again, I think it made him look bad because he's been saying this stuff forever, but for whatever reason, this interview just hit differently. So throughout the beginning of the first half of the interview, Nick is very hostile, he's argumentative, he is just not likable, if we're just being honest, because there are certain things that Piers is pressing him on and he does not appreciate it at all. And I think the way that he overreacts, especially in the beginning of the interview, is really telling, and it just makes you not like him, and you kind of see why other people don't like him, right? Because before this, he was showing up well-mannered, mild, not really over the top, but this just seems like he was on 10, he was on 100, and it just seemed very unnecessary. So even if he made good points throughout this interview, I think that the way that he showed up in the first half really set the tone for the rest of the interview, and you can't unsee it. In the second half, he was a little bit more laid back, and at one point he tried to tell Piers, like, hey, calm down, you're getting all worked up. But it was him who was worked up in the first half and not liking what Piers Morgan was saying about the different comments that he made. And I found that super interesting because he talked about how, people have been playing my clips, they've been using them against me, blah, blah, blah. So you should expect this, you should know how to handle this by now. And he did not react well, in my opinion, to having to defend his clip and calmly and reasonably explain what he was saying without feeling like he was being judged or attacked. Like, I don't know the best way to say that, but he was just so defensive in this interview that it really was not enjoyable to watch it from that aspect, even if there was a lot of funny moments and moments that were genuinely worth laughing at. It just overall made Nick look bad, in my opinion. I also want to point out that the context of what he was saying in his clips does matter, but when you have a repeated playing of your worst clip, the context almost doesn't matter anymore. Like, you can justify what you said and put it in its proper context, but the fact that you basically double down in this interview, you stand by what you say, you don't try to soften it in a way that is better received, and you're just hostile, you're argumentative, and all of that stuff, it doesn't really change how people perceive your clip. And so I do think that there were moments where he made his point, but also it was just too damaging, in my opinion, for him to really turn this interview around. Now, I'm actually really glad that Piers handled this interview the way that he did. I know that people said that he flip-flops, he carries water for the right, for the left, whatever, but he was the only man that Nick Fuentes has sat down who really held his feet to the fire like this. Bradley Martyn didn't do it, Tucker Carlson didn't do it, Dave Smith didn't do it, and who else did he sit down? Andrew Tate definitely didn't do it, right? And I was very disappointed with Andrew Tate, especially, and Tucker Carlson tried to press him a little bit on the whole marriage and women stuff, but for the most part, this was the only interview that I've seen, because I've not watched anything really before maybe 2023, because I don't know when the Show Snick podcast was with the guy Adam from the PBD podcast. I don't know when that was, I can't recall, but I haven't seen anything older really, so I don't know what he was like in interviews. And so up until that point, he seemed with defending in his interviews, because you could see that he was being ganged up on, he was being bullied, that sort of thing, and he wasn't punching back. But in this interview, for whatever reason, he punched back and it didn't look good good for him. And I think that Piers definitely shunned him at times, which basically means that obviously Piers is old enough to be his father, but when you think of a grown man and another grown man kind of beefing and arguing or whatever, usually one is going to come out on top. And depending on how like brutal it is, you would say like, hey, he shunned you. Like, it's kind of like not necessarily a sign of disrespect, but it's kind of saying who's top dog and who's not, right? And so I think that was the approach that Piers Morgan had in this interview, and he definitely did that. He didn't back down. He really pressed him on what he was saying, and he tried to really assert like, hey, this is not okay what you said. And nobody else has really done it to that degree the way that Piers Morgan did in this interview. And I really like that Piers Morgan said, hey, people are going to watch this and they're going to have their own opinion. And it was really funny how Nick was trying to say like, hey, people see what you're doing. They're going to see through it, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yes, they will see what Piers is doing, but they're also going to see how you're reacting, and they're either going to like it or they're not going to like it. And that's just what it is. Moving on, let's get into the racist family restaurant decisions.
He's not here to defend himself.
You are.
And my parents are.
You told the story.
And I will. And I'll
I'm not trying to ambush you.
As
I said at the start, Nick, to be clear.
No, it's not an ambush.
Nick, to be clear,
I think everybody
I'm not
understands.
ambushing you. I'm literally reading an anecdote that you revealed on your podcast. It's you that's put it in the public domain.
I know.
I'm simply asking you whether my assessment of that, which is that your father didn't want to take you to certain restaurants because of what you refer to as, they were commonly known as black fare, whether that attitude to African Americans in that instance permeated to you. It's a reasonable question.
Yeah, no, like I said, I think everybody knows what that is, but I'll address it. I'll engage with it, and I'll defend my father from the charge of racism.
Sure.
So this is super interesting because, again, Piers is just reading back to Nick what he said. So he shouldn't have a problem with his own words being thrown in his face, basically, right? Piers is just holding up a mirror to him and saying, hey, do you like what you see? And obviously Nick does not like that, right? And so because he put this story out there, he just needs to take the L on this. He assumes that because he tells a joke and people laugh, that people are either going to laugh or find his comments offensive. And because a lot of people are laughing, he is not realizing that people also find your comments offensive, right? And so when he's telling that joke, people are going to laugh, but they're also going to understand that his father may be racist or that he comes from a racist family. And he can't really push back on that, especially when he does say, hey, I'm a race realist or I'm a racist, whatever, right? He is owning the identity. So you can't own it proudly for yourself, but then be like, hey, that's not fair to call my dad that. Like, obviously you got that from somewhere, whatever, right? And so people are either going to think that you got that from your family, or they're going to think that you're the opposite of your family. And when you tell stories like that, they're not going to think that you're the opposite of your family. They're going to think that you're the product of your environment. And it was so interesting because he was talking about, well, my family's not racist. This is based on our lived experience. We lived around blacks. This is what my parents and my family dealt with. And so he's trying to say, like, this is not judging people based on their skin color. It's based on judging people by their action. But it's just a different way to say we're being racist because of X, Y, and Z, right? And so he tries to explain away the racism or what people perceive to be racism, but it just comes down to being just plain racism. So just in that one clip, you can see a lot of traps that Piers Morgan is setting for Nick Fuentes throughout this interview. He gets him to admit to one thing and then he uses it against him. And it's like, you should have seen that coming. Like, you were talking about how you thought that this was going to be an ambush in the Bradley Martyn interview. You did say throughout this interview that you didn't feel like it was an ambush, but you also got very defensive. But I just feel like it's weird to say it's not an ambush, but then you're defensive. So if you're defensive and it's not an ambush, what's going on, right? Next up, let's talk about immigration.
Part of the invasion would include your father, presumably, and his immediate descendants who came from Mexico.
Not really true, because when my father's ancestors came here, it was a small fraction of the total immigrants that came from Mexico. I don't believe that we should have zero immigrants forever, or even zero immigrants from non-white countries. But you have to draw the distinction.
So this is interesting because Piers is calling him out for being basically a quarter Mexican, and he's saying, well, your parents, your family came here from other countries, from Mexico even, and so basically you're against immigration, but your parents literally benefited from that. And so what he's trying to say is, oh, well, it was a smaller percentage, and it was different during that time that they came here and all of that stuff, right? And so what it comes down to is that you obviously want certain people to come into America, and you want a certain number of people to come into America from other countries. And so he goes on to talk about how because there's so many people from other countries, I think he said 10 million, he's basically saying this is not immigration, this is an invasion. And he's been talking about basically white people being replaced, eventually becoming the minority and losing power. And so that's really what he's talking about. And I think that Piers Morgan misunderstood him at one point because he's talking about being basically outnumbered and replaced and all of that stuff. And Piers Morgan said, well, how many Christians are there? I think he said 1 billion. And then he said maybe there's 5 million Jewish people or something like that. And so Piers is like, well, how are Jewish people going to make white people or Christians extinct if there's more Christians than Jewish people? And what Nick, I think, was talking about was white people, not necessarily Christian. And so I just found that part interesting. Moving on, they talk about blacks needing to be arrested.
Isn't for the most part?
Blacks are my biggest fans. I get high fives all the time. They say, Nick Fuentes, I love your show. They agree with me. And you want to know why? Here's the difference. Black people are the most victimized by other black people. You think black people want to live in the hood and the ghetto and get shot all the time? That's what happens in the south side of Chicago. You should come here. I'll take you there. We could go to Garfield Park.
My son went to Chicago
Inglewood.
University for a year, actually, several years ago.
Yeah, that's a bubble. That's a bubble. You think you're in Chicago and Hyde Park? You don't know Chicago. Go a little bit west, see what it's like over there. And I'll tell you, black people agree with me because they're tired of it too. And maybe not most of them, but a lot of them agree with what I say about that because they know how it is. That's why the first thing they do when they make a little bit of money is they go and leave to another neighborhood.
Okay, so what was...
So this is super interesting because I was expecting him to do a black accent when he was talking about black people love him and they come up to him and high five him and all of that stuff. But I think there's two things happening here. What he's saying is that he doesn't want to live around black people because they're violent, whatever. He wants to be around his own people. But at the same time, what he's saying does benefit black people because of black on black crime, right? And so it's kind of like not necessarily two birds with one stone, but it feels like what he's arguing is convenient and it happens to also impact black people, and that's why they agree with what he's saying. But there's a slight difference because what he's saying comes from more of a racist element, whereas what black people are saying comes more from a safety element, right? And so those are two different arguments, but you can connect the two because at the core of it, it's the same issue. You want to stop violent crimes from happening. Piers did get him to clarify that he means black murders, and so this was super interesting because in his clips, he's basically said, hey, you need to stay away from all black people. This is what's going to save your life, basically, because you're not discriminating, you're not doing pattern recognition, because obviously what most people would say is that if you see someone acting suspiciously, you obviously avoid them, keep your eyes on them, that sort of thing. But obviously what he's going to say is, well, all black people look suspicious, right? And so that's why you are staying away from all black people. And the flip side of that, and he acknowledges this, is that there are black people who are not violent who are going to be offended by this because you're going out of your way to avoid them and they haven't done anything to you and they won't do anything to you because they're not violent. And so Piers Morgan tries to flip this and he brings up school shootings, so we can go into this clip.
Maybe because
no one's buying this. This
kids.
argument lost. No one is buying this. Everybody understands per capita, and people can even see what you race ahead and say, well, we're comparing the proportion of white and black school shooters. I said, no, compare the proportion of school shooters that are white versus violent criminals that are black, because that was the basis of the monologue, is that you're very likely, if you encounter black people or a young black man in the city, that you're going to be the victim of a violent crime, of a robbery, a mugging, a car theft, a carjacking, or a murder. That's the difference, and it's about proportionality, and everybody sees past that.
Okay, so this was interesting because no, not everybody understands per capita. People literally don't understand, like when you say, hey, like more white people on welfare than black people, people don't understand, like, hey, well, proportionally, there's more white people, so of course more white people are going to be on welfare compared to black people who are a smaller number, but they have a higher number of people on welfare. So not everybody understands per capita. That's one. Two, what Piers is trying to say when he brings up the example of school shootings, he's saying that most school shooters are white men. And so he's trying to set up the argument that if you are scared of shootings happening, you need to be scared of white men, basically, right? That's the argument that he's making. And so I'm just going to read from my notes so that this is clear. If violent crime is an issue because they are committed the most by black people and you need to stay away from all black people, then the inverse is also true. If school shootings are an issue because they are committed the most by white boys or men, then every kid should stay away from white boys or men because they might shoot up a school. That's the argument that Piers is making. So if you say, hey, black people commit crimes, we need to stay away from all black people. If white people, white boys, white men are committing school shootings, you need to be wary, you need to be suspicious of all white boys and all white men because they might shoot up a school, right? So you want to watch them, make sure they're not doing anything funny. It's not just the weird antisocial white boys that you need to be wary of. It's all white men because you don't know who has the potential to shoot up a school. That's the argument that Piers is making. And so Nick tries to go into this per capita thing and say, well, hey, in proportion to all white men or whatever the white population, it's a smaller percentage, and that's not necessarily the argument. The argument is that if you say one thing and you need to stay away from all people because of that one thing, then the inverse is true when you apply it to other scenarios. So that's the point that Piers Morgan is trying to make. Okay, moving on, we're going to talk about Jewry. So Jewish people, a collection of Jewish people, and the Holocaust.
We got all that. Me mom, like I don't even know who this person is. Why is this person talking to me? This old British guy is saying me mom got killed by Hitler.
Because he doesn't find it funny when you say Hitler's very fucking cool.
I don't care. I don't care.
I know you don't care. That's fine. You don't have to care. But he does care.
Does that guy care about America? Does that guy care about me and my country and my family? No.
He cares what you, a prominent conservative in America, has to say about Adolf Hitler. Now, what do you mean by Hitler is very fucking cool? Because I think he's very fucking a monster.
Okay. And that's a clip. I think he's very fucking a monster. Do you hear yourself?
Yeah, I mean,
can we all grow up?
I do.
Can we all grow up?
He murdered 12.
Okay, so that was pretty funny, and it might be a clip, but Piers Morgan, he said that's effing cool like 20 times in this interview because he's really trying to make a point. He's trying to make a point of how ridiculous you sound saying that, right? And so, yes, this was a funny moment, but Piers is definitely trying to make a point. And what I will say is I didn't like that Piers basically ambushed him with this random person. I don't know who this person is. And this is kind of like a emotional manipulation tactic, basically. You're trying to make him feel bad by telling the story of what happened to this guy. And I think that is okay, but in this interview, it's not necessary. You don't need to bring in other people. Just literally play Nick's own clips and those will make him look bad, right? And so I did not like that he brought in this third-party person to basically shame or guilt Nick into feeling bad. That's obviously not going to work. But what I will say is I didn't like the way that Nick was making fun of this person because obviously he should have had more compassion and said, hey, I get where you're coming from. That's not my issue. I don't really care, that sort of thing. There was a nicer way that he could have said that instead of making fun of that person. There's a portion in the interview where Piers just basically says, hey, you're cool. You're mean to people and you're cool. And he doesn't understand what he means by that. And this is an example of that. You were cool to this person for no reason. Even though this was a setup and this was unnecessary, you could have reacted much better to what that person said. Now, I was confused because they were talking about the Holocaust and they were basically talking about how Nick is a Holocaust denier. He didn't think that 6 million people died, but then he said, well, I think actually more than that could have died. But then it seems like they don't really get clarity on whether or not Nick actually thinks that many people died, because what I will say is that he says, well, this should be open for debate. He talks about how even if people agree that 6 million people die, the fact that if you say the opposite or you say anything else, you get jailed, you get arrested, you get criticized, you get shunned, that sort of thing. He's basically asking if you question the truth, or even if you agree with the truth but you have questions and you get punished for it, that looks bad, right? Why are you trying to make sure that this is the only thing that people say? And I think that is a valid question, but I also feel like we don't really know what Nick actually thinks about the number of people who died in the Holocaust, and he just makes it more confusing when he says, well, actually I think that more people could have died, but then he's also questioning it. That just seems a little weird to me. Piers also tried to catch Nick in a trap where he said, do you have Jewish friends? He said, yes, I have plenty of Jewish friends. I have black friends. And then he plays a clip where basically Nick is saying that Jewish people and Christians can't be friends. And then he says, well, how can you say that if you have Jewish friends, black friends, that sort of thing? And so Nick is saying, well, I'm talking about groups. The groups are pitted against each other. That doesn't mean that individuals can't be friends with people who are Jewish or Christian, that sort of thing. And so when he gives that example, it makes sense. And he gives the example of how if you're black, you can have white friends, and if you're white, you can have black friends, right? And so he's saying that, I guess that's more the exception and not the rule. I'm not sure if I have that backwards, but basically what he's saying is that, like, historically, the groups are pitted against each other, but you do have people who within the fighting between the groups are actually friends. And so I'll give him a point on that, but I can understand why Piers thought that this is going to be a gotcha moment, but it wasn't, in my opinion. Moving on to women and marriage.
Let me explain to you what I think it is. I think when a 27-year-old guy who's never got laid, never had a meaningful relationship with a woman, says that women shouldn't be allowed to vote, they should stay at home, that all they do is fantasize about being raped and being beaten up. That's what they want. That they're annoying, that they get fat, that they get ugly. That's a misogynist. Now, you may not understand it because your knowledge of women is so incredibly tiny, but actually you are the embodiment of a misogynist. It couldn't be clearer.
So Piers is basically talking about how Nick is basically talking bad about women, and when he's doing this and his followers are hearing this, that is not motivating them to get married, right? And so he points out, you're 27 years old. I don't know why, but him saying you're 27 years old, you've never had a relationship, you've never been a woman, you don't have kids, obviously. For some reason, that just hit differently when you put all of that together in the same sentence, whatever, right? And so anyway, he's saying you're talking bad about women, and why would this make your followers want to get married? And so Nick says, well, I do tell my followers to get married, blah, 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 but you really have to understand the contradiction there, because if you're constantly criticizing women, you're saying they're annoying, there's no motivation for your followers to want to get married. And then Piers hits him with a zinger here, because he said, you're going on and on about how the white race is going extinct, but you're contributing to it when you tell people not to get married, not to have kids, because women are annoying, right? And so that was really funny, because that tells you that you're not really thinking about the consequences of what you're saying, because again, with the restaurant joke, you think people are just laughing at it, but you don't understand that people are also taking away from it that your father may be racist, your family may be racist, right? And so in this situation, you're criticizing women, you're making fun of them, but you don't realize that this is contributing to white people not having kids. This is contributing to other people not having kids because you're talking badly about women. Now, in relation to him saying that women couldn't vote, they did go on about this, and he said, I think in the Bradley Martyn interview or a different one, he thinks that people should have human rights, but when it comes to voting, I guess he doesn't see that as a human right. And so I just want to clarify that, because he does bring that up in this interview, and he talked about, well, the genders are distinct, they have two different biological realities, blah, blah, blah. Women should be able to vote, like, we don't need to hash this out, so I don't agree with this take at all. And then he talked about women in his DMs, because Piers is just laying into him about, like, hey, you've never been laid, you've never been with a woman, you've never been in a serious relationship, right? So he's just dinging him, like, you have no experience in this area, so why should people listen to you, basically? And so he's like, well, you should see my DMs, blah, blah, blah. And it's funny because he's talking about women being in his DMs, but then he later admits, like, well, they're not attractive, right? And so it does not count unless you have baddies in your DMs, so whatever, right? And so that was just a really funny moment, because Piers is really laying into him about his opinions on women. And I think that this is a much needed pushback from from Piers Morgan, because as I mentioned, Tucker was really the only one who did this. I really wanted Andrew Tate to do this when he sat down with Myron Gaines and Andrew Tate. And so it is nice to really see someone holding him accountable who's not another woman, because that's just not going to get anywhere. Candace tried that didn't get anywhere, right? And so Piers, he's not like the most masculine man, because I think of masculinity in terms of Black culture, and he obviously doesn't embody that. And so I find it super interesting that Piers Morgan is the one who's holding him accountable, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think it's obviously much needed. You really do need to hold a mirror up to him and say, hey, you're complaining about your people being extinct, but you're contributing to the problem because you're telling people not to have relationships, basically, or you're making them not want to have relationships and want to hang out with other men and whatever, right? And so that's just really interesting when you think about what he's saying on a deeper level. Moving on, they do talk about how Nick thought the interview went. He does say that he thinks it wasn't an ambush. I think he says he thought it was a good interview. I think it is one of Nick's worst interviews. And so Piers brings up the question because they talk about labels throughout this interview. You're a racist, you're a misogynist, all of this stuff, and you're an anti-Semite and all of this stuff, right? And so he hits him with a question. He says, what would you do, or how would you react if the Pope basically disavowed you and basically said that you're a bad person? And so we can play the clip on Nick's answer to that question.
Would it matter to you if the Pope did? He's an American Pope, obviously.
It would be very disheartening, yes.
Why?
Because he's our spiritual leader. He's the head of the church. He's the vicar of Christ. So if he condemned me, that would be very disheartening. And it would depend upon what he would say exactly. But yeah, I wouldn't like that. I wouldn't like that at all.
If he condemned you because you've openly admitted to being a racist on this show?
Oh, this racist, I would be disappointed if he said that, because I think that word racist, it means something different to everybody. And so I think that's just silly. I think that's just semantic.
Have you ever been...
So I find that interesting because I don't know if people have different definitions of racism, but there's different degrees of racism. So you can have some people who are just flat out racist. They will say crazy stuff to your face, in your DMs, in your comment section, in person, right? And then you have other people who are kind of racist, but they kind of tone it down, right? And so there's an example that I want to give because I was talking to someone and he plays basketball, and he was basically saying that on his team, because basketball is majority Black, so you do have some all-white teams in colleges and high schools, and then you have majority Black teams with maybe like less than 5 white guys, right? And so in the NBA, in college sports, as far as basketball is concerned, white boys are the minority, right? And so he was basically saying that when the white kid was around the Black teammates, he wasn't really racist, he wasn't saying anything, but when he got around his other white friends, he was leaning into that racist energy. He felt more confident in being racist around them because he had backup, right? And so there are people who are racist like that, to where they know, okay, I can't say anything here because this is not going to go over well. And then there's other situations where they feel free to speak and say whatever they want because they know that they have backup, they know nothing's going to happen to them. And so Nick kind of operates like that, where he tones down what he's saying depending on his audience, and then when he's doing his show, that is where he is the most vocal about his controversial opinion. And it's just interesting because it goes back to labels. Obviously, if you ask him if he thinks he's an anti-Semite, if he thinks he's racist, he's going to say no, and it's not his answer that matters, it's how people perceive him that matters. Alrighty, so that's everything that I wanted to talk about in this interview. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Did Nick Fuentes have a good interview? Was this his worst interview? Did Piers Morgan take an L? Or did Piers Morgan take a good stance in confronting Nick Fuentes? Let me know your thoughts below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.